Without further ado, I'll just briefly introduce the second wonderful panel that I have the pleasure to moderate. First, we have Alonso Cueto, who's an acclaimed Peruvian writer, author of 20 books that span several genres, including novels, essays, short stories, and he has been translated into 16 languages. So he's an expert in translation, for sure. His novel, Laura Azul, won the prestigious Herralde Award in 2005, and the translation to English, which has been done by Frank Wynne, The Blue Hour, has been awarded the Valle Inclán Prize for Translation as well. Alonso Cueto's works have also been adapted for film, and some of his most recent publications include Palabras de Otro Lado, which has won the Juan Goytisolo Narrative Award, La Perricholi, and Otras Caricias. And Frank Wynne, next to me, is an Irish translator from French and Spanish, or Frenches and Spanishes, as we might talk about in a minute, with more than 20 years of experience. Among many others, he has translated Michel Houellebecq, Amadou Kourouma, Tomás Eloy Martínez, and Almudena Grandes. As I mentioned, he won the Valle Inclán Award for his translation of The Blue Hour, and has recently, many congratulations, received the Dublin Literary Award for his translation of The Art of Losing by Alice Seniter. So welcome, thanks very much for being here.
Yeah.
Yes. And I might start with a similar question. What's your relationship to translation, Alonso? How has translation influenced the way you write? And also, how has translation, I suppose, impacted on the way you perceive your own writing in other languages?
Well, thank you very much, Laura. I think that when I read my first novels when I was very young, I read Alexander Dumas or Jules Verne, and I never thought of those novels as a translation of anything. I just thought they were the novels that I loved, that I lived with, and that I dreamed with, and they were just what they were for us. And after that, well, I learned that they were translations from other languages. And at that time, when I was young, the authors of the boom started being very popular in Latin America. And we suddenly had 100 Years of Solitude and La Ciudad y los Perros and all these novels that made us feel so, with such a burst of our own language in originals in Spanish. So one of my favorite authors, who's Henry James, I also read first in Spanish, with great translations. And that's, I almost never make a distinction between original and translation if I love a book. On the other hand, I remember, the question makes me remember what Borges said talking about Borges before in the preceding, that he read El Quijote first in English, and when he read it in Spanish, he thought the English version was better than the Spanish one, because he loved English so much. And I remember one time they asked Gregory Rabassa a kind of aggressive question. They asked him if he really knew enough Spanish to translate 100 Years of Solitude. And he said, I'm sure I know enough Spanish to translate that book, but I don't know if I know enough English because of all the nuances and textures that are in that book, and I don't know if I can find the English words to match those. This thing of matching perhaps is not the right word. Perhaps we should talk about representing, reenacting, making these words in one language alive in another. And I think that's an incredible task, because I think, and Frank knows this because he's such a great translator, a translator is before anything a reader and then also a writer. And so it's an incredible task what you have.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, and this echoes what Nuria was talking about, that the most important aspect of translation is finding your own language or discovering your own language. And perhaps, Frank, you can talk about that. I was going to ask you, first of all, you have mentioned before that you don't translate from French and Spanish, but from Frenches and Spanishes. So I was going to ask you how your experience of translating Peruvian Spanish has been, but also perhaps you can talk about your experience translating into English and whether you use as well Hiberno English or how you find your words in English.
Okay, that's a whole novel there. So, I mean, like Alonso, I grew up reading translations without realizing I was reading translations. Apart from anything else, nobody bothered to put a translator's name on them at the time. And so I read, the 19th century realists, and I read Dumas, and I read, and as far as I was concerned, these were books. And one of the things that I find most depressing about when we talk about world literature now is somehow, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Flaubert all get ushered in, and they're just literature. Mm-hmm. But world literature is actually, there's obscure writers. Whoever was proudly saying in the Daily Telegraph last week, and I've never even heard of Eddie Ernaux. Really? I mean, okay, so you're ignorant, but don't boast about it. In terms of translation, basically what I had no understanding of before I learned a second language, to speak a second language, was that there is an assumption that people writing in or speaking in different languages are saying the same things using different words. This is not true. How you think is shaped by the language in which you think, and therefore when you're translating somebody else's language, you need to find ways of expressing thoughts that actually are not easily expressed in your language because they don't occur in that way. And actually, John's mentioned earlier of Hiberno English. Hiberno English has been hugely useful to me because Hiberno English basically, although it is a dialect of English, replicates much of the grammar of Irish. Mm-hmm. Even the sort of paddywhackery stuff of at all is direct translation from Irish of a double. So, for example, 2-3 years ago, I was translating a novel called Animalia by Jean-Baptiste Rameau, the first section of which is set on a small farm running from about 1899 to 1913. And I need voices for the characters in this small village who are largely uneducated farmers and deeply Catholic. I also need an awful lot of words to do with farming. I have never been so glad to have been raised in rural Ireland as I was, and indeed brought up Catholic as I was at that point. I mean, to know what the churching of women was, let alone to have to describe what the churching of women was. But I used what you can't do, of course, is then give a French character an Irish accent. But what you can do is using the various bits and pieces that make up Hiberno English, the way in which we invert verbs or move the subject of the verb, and create a local dialect that is not co-opting and is not specific to any place. When I said Frenches and Spanishes, this is much clearer in Spanish because much of, probably the great majority of French literature that is translated comes from France or from possibly Belgium or maybe Switzerland. Despite the fact that there are many great authors from North Africa, from West Africa, from the Lebanon, from Martinique, from Mauritius, etc., all of whom, from Haiti, all of whom write in English. One of the greatest novelists I've ever translated, Amadou Kourouma, was from Côte d'Ivoire. In Spanish, it's much clearer because actually there is peninsular Spanish, and then there is all the Spanishes of South America. So I ended up translating from Spanish because once I discovered that I wanted to translate full-time, I realized I couldn't afford to live here. By here, I mean anywhere in Europe. So I lived for about 10 years in Latin America and in Central America and South America. I went there with the lyrics to La Bamba and nothing else. I had no education in Spanish. So I lived in Costa Rica, and then I lived in Argentina, and then I traveled a lot in Peru and Ecuador. And when I started translating, one of the most frustrating things is quite how different those languages are. And I don't simply mean the slang or the vernacular. I mean the register at which people speak to one another. I mean, it's all very well to say "qué tal" to someone on the streets of Buenos Aires, but cross the river to Uruguay and we're back to usted all the way. So you have all of that. But then you also have the fact that Peruvian Spanish and Mexican Spanish are both highly influenced by indigenous languages in a way that Colombian Spanish is not. Cuban Spanish is highly influenced by Yoruba, by Santeria, by all sorts of things. And all of these things you have to learn. And you have to culturally absorb all of those things in order to be able to translate from that particular Spanish. Interestingly, going the other way, French publishers will always say which English a book is translated from. So it will say John Bandel, traduit de l'anglais, irlandais. They accept that all of these are different iterations of English.
Yes, they were. I saw some translations in French that say traduit de l'américaine, not from English, but from the American. Yes, yeah. They used to use those words. Yeah, as following on what Frank was saying, when I met Gregory Rabasa, he was translating this book by Luis Rafael Sanchez, La Guaracha del Macho Camacho. That's the name of the novel. But he was memorizing a lot of Puerto Rican songs like El Jibarito. He was, because that was part of his training. And it's an important thing with all these indigenous languages, the slang in different countries is so different. And how do you train slang from one country to slang of the other, if there is any possibility of doing that? So I think it's so incredibly hard. Besides, I think, as what John Bandel said before, that the books they're written in a more elaborate language, like the ones written, like he said, in poetry, are more difficult to translate. I am more trying a different version.
I mean, I think from my point of view, I don't think of translation as being quite in a different medium. It is closer to attempting to play a piece written for piano and violin, or a piece written for violin and something else. The only person who can actually hear what Bach wrote, or Schubert wrote, or Caetano Veloso wrote, is someone who can read the music and hear it in their head while they're reading it. Everything else is interpretation. The moment anyone sings it, the moment anyone plays it, that's interpretation. What translators do is they perform and they interpret a text. That's all they can do. So they have this text that they can read, their target reader cannot read, and therefore they need to play it in using an instrument, using a voice that can be understood. And they have to try and do that without taking away what makes it itself. I mean, believe me, particularly translation into English, you don't have to go back very far to horror stories of how books were translated. I mean, the original translation of Jules Verne into English of Journey to the Centre of the Earth, which I have also translated, which, if you've ever read it, is set in Hamburg and in Iceland. The original English version is set in Scotland. The names of all of the characters are different, and they've inserted 2 additional chapters which are supposed to give a sort of moral legitimacy to the text. Now, that one hasn't been in print for quite some time, but most recently, the most recent egregious thing was Milan Kundere's The Joke, when it was published in 1969, was published in 2 separate translations, one in the UK, one in the United States. The one in the UK was fine. The one in the US cut 30% of the text and rearranged all of the passages so that the novel took place in chronological order. And it was 2 years before somebody from the Cornell Department of Eastern European Languages said, I don't know what you're reviewing here, but it is certainly not Milan Kundere's The Joke. There was a time when the hegemony of sort of English triumphs all other things is, well, let's lose this. The English, an English reader won't understand that. It is crucial that English readers get round to understanding that the world is bigger than they are.
I think we are always translating. We translate every day. I think that a writer translates his experiences and his imagination and whatever he has inside to words. And I think perhaps the job of a translator is much more difficult because it's not only to translate those words, but all the experiences that come behind them. And I live in a country in Peru that Frank knows well, where we have different languages. We have several hundred of languages in the same place. We are always trying to translate each other, which is one of the reasons it's so interesting and so difficult at the same time, for a country. And as a matter of fact, if I could bring you back to this 16th of November of 1532, there's something happens that day that changes the history of not only of Latin America, but of the world. And that's the day that Francisco Pizarro, the Spanish conqueror, comes and meets with the last Inca. And there's this, he sends this priest, Vicente Valverde, and shows the Inca the Bible and tells him, this is the word of God. We are under the Emperor Charles, and you have to surrender because this is the truth. And this is translated by some person who did not know very much Spanish nor Puquina, another language. So, and he tells something to the Inca, to the ruler of the Inca Empire, that, well, different versions, but has him throw the Bible to the ground, and that's when the Spaniards say, well, they attack and they conquer the Inca Empire. So it's, in a way, a country founded on a mistranslation. Mm-hmm. So you could say.
Interestingly, in the beginning of Alicenita's novel, The Art of Losing, the occupation of, or the invasion of Algeria by the French was born of a mistranslation. There is quite a lot of that going on. In translating Alonso's novels, I need to have you cannot translate something you do not understand. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I need to understand much more about Peru than I would normally do in order to be able to do that. And one of the things when Nuri was saying earlier that, you ask authors about specific things in whatever, or, first you Google it, then you do that. I've got no idea how I did this before there was such a thing. But in The Wind Traveller, this was a co-translation with a young emerging translator. So she did, thank you, she did an initial draft. Mm-hmm. And there is a piece in Lima, and she's got a note, in track changes in the Word document that says, I don't know how to translate El Cerro Morado. So I've said the purple swelling. And I said, you do realize this is a place, you don't translate it, it's just El Cerro Morado. But you didn't know it was a place. On the other hand, the first thing you do when you find a collocation of words together in any text that you don't understand is think, is this a reference to something? Does this mean something? I mean, when in translating John's The Blue Guitar starts with an extraordinarily well-known phrase from Twelfth Night, snapper up of unconsidered trifles. You're going to need to find a way to do that, which is not straightforwardly going to relate back to a translation of Shakespeare, unless there happens to be. So, for example, I have Pierre Lemaitre, whose historical novels I'm translating and have been for some time. Pierre loves to include allusions to and quotations from books that he loves. Obviously, books that he loves in French. Many of which are in translation. And at the end of his book, he will go, the attentive reader will have noticed that I have gone, I've said to him, you don't understand, there is no standard translation of Baudelaire, of Rimbaud, of whatever. No one's going to necessarily, of course I'm going to do what you want me to do. I said, but what I'm also going to do is I'm also going to put in a whole bunch of my own. And I'm going to add those writers on at the end. And I'm particularly going to take them from writers that you particularly like William Gaddis and William McAvaney and whatever. Because it carries on what it is that he wants to do, but cannot quite be done in the way that he's already done it. Mm-hmm. When you were talking about listening to music when translating from Puerto Rican, I translated a Colombian novel by Andrés Caicedo, Que Vive la Música, which the entire second two-thirds of that is either lyrics from titles of or excerpts of salsa songs, most of them written by Richie Ray and Bobby Cruz, most of which the lyrics are partly in Spanish and partly in Yoruba. And they have famously, they're not alive anymore, but when they were alive said, we don't know what the lyrics mean. But of course they were woven through the text and they had to mean something in the text. Because actually they were used as narrative drive, they were used as dialogue. So what I had to do was I spent 2 years listening to this music and fitting everything to that rhythm and recreating rhyme where I needed to, because I knew this was actually part of a song, even though the person reading the book would not know that that was part of the song.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Translation is a lot about research as well, and certainly adaptation. Sorry, go ahead.
In the Blue Hour, in the version that Frank did, I remember there is a very extreme experience of the character of this woman, and then she suddenly talks to her parents, and of course the translation, the whole translation is in English, but in that exact moment, Frank, I think, did something great. I never told you this, which is that she called not mother and father, but papa y mamá. And in that moment, it sounded so true that she should use, even in the English translation, the Spanish words. And I thought it was a great touch for making the scene more tender, like not translating those two words, those basic two words for any character. No? So that's something that I've never told it, but today I'm telling her for the first time.
Yeah, very interesting, kind of keeping the original language to...
Well, particularly for very emotive words. I mean, as somebody said when asking about the eternal question of how do you translate the first sentence of L'étranger, you know, aujourd'hui maman est morte. Peut-être hier, je ne sais plus. Okay, so the original version is, in translation, is mother died today. Unless you're a public school boy from the 1950s, you do not call maman mother. So I was doing a translation that I was supposed to be reading on stage, and I said, okay, so my translation would be maman died today, because that's what he calls his mother. And 3 sentences later, he's going to refer to her as mother, so I need 2 different words there. And they said, well, you know, what about, you know, how do you do it otherwise? I said, well, okay, otherwise, the mammy died today. I mean, if we're going to do that, then actually you're pulling it very far away. And so mama and papa or mija are words that actually are perfectly understandable in context, but have an emotional resonance that going around calling people my daughter doesn't have.
Yeah, of course. And speaking about emotions, I'm quite interested to ask you both, but Alonso specifically, in some of your books, especially the ones that have been translated into English, The Blue Hour and The Wind Traveller, you deal with quite emotional, traumatic experiences in the story and in the history of Peru. And I really wanted to ask you how you approach that in terms of language, how that was created, I suppose, how that was approached.
Well, it's very difficult to find the words, you know, that correspond to what you want to describe, what you want to tell. You know, it's very hard to find the tone, the music. So I usually what I do is I just wander around thinking of the best phrases that I can think of, no, to express what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to represent, and with much attention to the music, no, also. I just think that when you're a writer, you're always thinking about ways of saying things, and at all times, you can wake up in the middle of the night with a phrase that you think is the best for you. I recently read this book by Edith Grossman, Why Translation Matters, and she says that she was asked to translate Don Quixote de la Mancha into English, and she didn't know if she was to accept the job, but then she thought of the first phrase, of course everybody knows the first phrase in Spanish, ¿no? En un lugar de la Mancha, de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme, and so forth. And then she thought of the best equivalent of that phrase, which I do not dare to say here because I'm quoting by heart, no, pero... But when she got that phrase, she said that she could continue, no? And that's I think it's pretty much the same for me. If I get a few of the first phrases, I think I can go on. And I, by the way, I admire the beginning of L'Étranger as well. It's just
I find Alonso's books, I mean, a number of them, as you say, deal with a particularly difficult period and the aftermath of a particularly difficult period in Peru. The 2 novels are very different. What's interesting about Laura Azul and The Blue Hour is that our first voice is a smug, self-satisfied lawyer whose real worry about what his father might have been up to in a barracks is how this will impinge on his life and his wife's life and his kids' life. This is an easy person for people outside of Peru as well as people inside of Peru to understand. So actually the extraordinary emotion of what we later learn is all the more powerful because actually his first reaction to this whole thing was, how do we bury it? How do we make this go away? How do we not experience this emotion? And the same is true in reverse in The Wind Traveller, where someone who has survived comes face to face with someone. And again, it is about what is not, it is about trying not to say something. In much the way that when somebody once asked Larry Olivier how he cried on stage, he said, I try very hard not to. And if you're trying to act crying, trying very hard not to, is how people cry.
Yeah, absolutely. We're coming to the end of the session, but I really wanted to ask you your thoughts about not just the process and the art of translation, but also the process of, I suppose, reaching readers and how that happens. And so my questions are first for Alonso, whether you feel that you as a Peruvian author still have to go through the Spanish publishing scene to reach readers at a more global level. Obviously, this is not the case anymore as you're a globally recognized author, but whether you think that still happens. And then, Frank, your thoughts about that sort of relationship to finish in English.
Yeah, Spain has, in the 60s, the Spanish American authors, until the 60s, I mean, it was very difficult for them because some of the slang and the words, like Julio Cortázar's Lunfardo or Juan Rulfo's Mexican language, would be corrected, entre comillas, by the editors of the Spanish publishing houses. But then Carlos Barral came along, and he just decided to respect everybody. You can imagine if you say the beginning of Pedro Páramo in Spanish slang, that would be a little funny to read. So that changed a lot. But I remember that Vargas Llosa's books were even corrected, and in the 60s. So that it's been very important. Many Spanish publishers have been very open to Latin America, and yes, I think that we still feel that the Spanish recognition is very important. Even considering that many Latin American books have not been recognized, should be so. So. On the other hand, we have a language that we can understand each other. Now I can see my Spanish friends here, and we can talk, and we can understand each other very well, which is not the same as, for example, French Canadians and French people from France. And it's maybe because we have these open vowels in our languages in common. So I think that this is more and more. Some Spanish words are understood in Spain, like culebrón, for instance, for soap opera, in Spain, in Latin America, or el ninguneo, which is Mexican in Spain. So it's been, Oscar Wilde said that Britain and the United States were the two countries separated by the same language, yes, which is not true, I think, anymore.
I think a lot of European countries which facilitated our discovery of writers from many other countries have also done a lot to block it. So I can probably say with almost 100% certainty that not a single writer who was never published in Spain was ever translated into English. Spanish writer. Similarly, probably only one or two French writers. Excluding French-Canadian writers. But if you're talking about the French diaspora, the francophonie, you are successful first and foremost in France, and then whatever. And this is just part of the system. Basically, British editors and American editors buy their rights at the London Book Fair and at Frankfurt from their European counterparts. There used to be quite a large publishing sector in both Mexico and in Argentina. There isn't anymore. And there was never one in say, Haiti or Mauritius or whatever. So everything comes filtered through there. But actually, Spain does something worse. So I remember bitching with is probably better. Fernando Vallejo, a great Colombian novelist. And what really annoyed him is that all the books that are translated into Spanish are translated into peninsular Spanish. So whether from English or French or German or Japanese or whatever, nobody thinks about the fact that actually there are a lot more Mexicans in the world than there are, people from Spain. Why is this the language? Why is this proper Spanish? So interestingly, Luis Schwartz, who founded a small publishing house in Brazil, must be nearly 20 years ago now. At the time, all Portuguese rights were sold to Lisbon, to publishers in Lisbon, and then the books were distributed in Brazil. And he decided the languages were sufficiently different, this made no sense. So he started retranslating and publishing books in Brazil. They are now the largest publisher in Brazil. They are also now part of Penguin, which bought into them. His first novel, his first translation, his first book, was a new translation of To the Finland Station, and he got it to number 1 on the bestseller list. Not because it was by Edmund Wilson, not because it's a great book, but because it was a very good book, and actually it spoke to people in their language. So there is, there will never be multiple translations, but it would be really interesting for, say, Cormac McCarthy to be translated into Mexican Spanish rather than, there are a lot of horses there, there's a lot of Mexicanness going on there. He'd be much more entertaining in that sense.
Also, there's a stereotype, as probably what Frank is saying, because I once heard a Colombian writer in Madrid talk about her work. And she said, well, I write novels about different subjects, but everybody wants me to write about drug traffic and violence and so forth. But then they present my novels, which are love stories or stories of grown men, and they say, but no, you're Colombian. You have to write about this, drugs and violence and so forth. What do you mean? But I'm not interested in that. No, but
this is a particular problem. I will stop in 1 second. This is a particular problem in books that are acquired into English, which is that, so you're from Rwanda. Could you write about the genocide? You weren't born? Was your mother born at the time? Oh, you're from Spain. Okay, well, it has to be the Civil War or the Black Decade if you're from Argentina. And it is what we as Anglophone readers seem to want, or certainly what editors think we want, is a tiny novel that will explain everything to us about your country so we never have to read about it again. Here's the great Uzbek novel.
Yes, I mean, there's certainly, we could go on for a long time about this kind of didactic sort of aim of translation, I suppose, in the eyes of publishers, I think, a lot of the time. Unfortunately, the session has to come to an end, but thank you so very much for such a fascinating
Laura.
conversation. Muchísimas gracias. Un placer y un honor para mí.
RTE supporting the arts.
Supporting artists. Supporting us.